The other question that we really have to face head on here, Dylan, is there are people within the community that strongly believe that JavaScript it's deficient in these various ways, and it really needs the assistance of tooling on top of it to make it good enough for modern development. And you see that in various ways from the DevOpsy side of things like the Webpacks and the Babels of the world, but you also see it in things like TypeScript, where we've said, you know what, the language itself isn't giving us the information that, for example, our IDE needs. So let's put another tool on top of it, and let's restrict ourselves to these certain set of patterns. And I really wonder if that's the case, and where that leads us to the future. What are your thoughts?
I think it's really good that we have the ability to do that in JavaScript before we shove more features into the language. And I think that's been one of the best things about the TC39 process that started after ES4 was kind of thrown out because it was just not well conceived and well thought through by the entire community. And so what I really like about the TC39 process is that features are proposed and there's a lot of time to make sure the feature is right. And they're not afraid to throw a feature out if it doesn't make sense or if it can't be done in a way that won't break the language in some future way or some unexpected way before it's too late. And the nice thing about having tools like Babel and TypeScript and Webpack and other things is you can try these things and you can really push them to the limits without having to have anything new built into the language. But then if you find things that work really well, then you sort of have the opportunity to standardize them and put them into the language. And so, I mean, we're even seeing that in some ways in CSS now with some of the post-CSS approaches and really just having the ability to experiment on top of the language before saying, I can't do anything till I have traits on a class system, and instead saying, hey, let me build a way to do traits on top of classes and see what that feels like and realize that it's not great, so let me try something else, is really powerful. And I think it's one of the main things driving the adoption and growth of the language as a whole.
So I used to be a huge proponent of this experimentation, as you say. I, back in the day, built a bunch of little like ad hoc tools to like try out my own ideas around syntax and so forth. And over time, it seems like the community has shifted away from the idea that we can have lots of varied experimentation, because from a perspective of teams, if every developer on the team has decided that they like their own little special mix of these tools and experiments, that creates chaos for the team. So I'm not so sure that I totally believe in the idea of chaos-driven development, if you will, like just having everybody try things. But then you ask yourselves, you know, obviously experimentation is how evolution happens, but who is the holder of those keys? Who gets to decide that we as a community are going to experiment with this thing, but we're not going to experiment with this thing?
Yeah, there's a few points in there. So I didn't really mean, hey, let's everyone do their own thing. Because I more meant, hey, everyone who thinks they want to propose a change to the language should probably first have a way to experiment with it before they draft a formal proposal and it goes through committees and stuff. It's much better to have a working example that shows, hey, this is what it would look like and here's the impact it would have, which I think is really nice. But I mean, I think there's sort of the ecosystem will end up having de facto standards. In the past, for example, with modules, before we had ESM, we had CommonJS and AMD. And neither were perfect, but they both served a viable use case and they worked for a while. And they helped us find the things that were wrong so that we could hopefully find a better path forward with a standardized module system. And it got to a point where it was very clear to the community that, hey, we need a module syntax for the language. So you sort of reach these tipping points where there are de facto standards. They're not good enough without a change to the grammar of the language. We need something consistent so we don't have bespoke, module systems for everyone and every project so that we can have actual interoperability. So when these features kind of become mainstream or are about to become mainstream in terms of the community as a whole wants them, it's kind of the point where you need to say, okay, we need a standard. And something tends to emerge. And it's almost always a little bit too late, but that's probably better than it being a little bit too early, in my opinion.
Well, you know what they say about standards? The greatest part about having more standards is now you have more standards. So
Right,
we'll
right.
create 15 standards, and then a 16th one will finally bring them all together. You know,
Absolutely. I mean, you look at like callback functions leading to promises, leading to generators, leading to async functions, leading to, you know, and then, but I mean, without promises, you couldn't really even start to think about those other constructs on top of it, right? So some, like the argument about ES classes are dumb, right? Well, they're kind of intentionally dumb because they're like that first step. They're like promises for async programming. Yeah, you don't need a class. Just like with promises, you don't need a promise. You could do callback functions, but it's a grammar that's consistent for a particular type of programming that some people like. But then once you sort of have that in there, you realize everything you're missing, and you sort of push to add more and more without making it so complex that no one wants to use it. And that's how we avoid becoming something unpopular or unusable, hopefully.
I understand why TC39 put in a primitive like a promise, and I even kind of understand why they put in a primitive like a class, even though I'm not a big fan of classes, and you know I'm well documented on that fact. I understand why they put those primitives in, but every time they put a primitive in, it now becomes a new sink for new features to be thrown on top of, and we're actually already seeing that with classes. It's not just syntactic sugar anymore. Now they're adding all kinds of crazy and in some cases unprecedented stuff on top of it. And there's a lot of pressure on the language. Everybody wants to pull it in their own direction. It's not just two, it's now 5 or 10 different directions that it's being pulled in. And, you know, as somebody who educates about JavaScript, it is a frustration for people that want to learn to always feel like it's a constant moving surface, that there's never any predictability. It's not just class anymore. Now it's class and all this other stuff I have to learn. And I wonder, you know, what's happening with WebAssembly is the pressure release valve. Is WebAssembly saying, let's stop trying to force JavaScript to be everything to everybody and start saying, if you're going to feel that the browser is your portal to the world, pick whatever language already does the stuff that you want it to do in the way that you want it to do it and compile down. Now, that's a good marketing story, but there are some downsides, obviously, to WebAssembly. So I'm troubled by feeling like we just have to throw so many more things into the language just because somebody says, this is the way that I like to write my objects, for example.
I mean, if you look at how many features landed in ES 2016, 2017, and 2018, it's really not that many. About 90% of the proposed features or more over that time have not made it to stage 4. Either they were abandoned, rejected, or they're still being thought through. And that's good, right? Because it means there's this tension that says, unless this thing really makes sense or is really obvious, we're probably not going to agree on it very fast. And it's going to take time to get it right. So I don't think there's been any features on top of ES classes in 3 years that have actually been added to the language yet. Now, that's a good thing, right? Because it means we're not rushing to add more things that we might not need. But the debates are important to have and to figure out.